dive right into grain protein and fertility because, as Heather mentioned, protein is one of the key quality parameters or standards by which bread wheat is evaluated, whether it can be used for bread or whether it just goes as feed, perhaps. And so there's generally a standard of about 12%. There's a little, some of the bakers we're working with are willing to fiddle a little bit with that lower, but generally the standard is 12% grain protein is required. And nitrogen fertility is probably one of the key practice that influences that. Go ahead, Eric. All right. With bread wheat, it's not just the total amount of nitrogen that's available to the crop, but it's also when nitrogen is available, what the timing of that availability is. So I just put the wheat growth stages here of wheat. Nitrogen uptake basically follows this kind of general curve that there's a little bit taken up early when it's tillering, and then during stem extension it takes up a lot more, and then that levels off as the crop matures. Nitrogen that's available earlier in the season tends to influence yield, the total crop yield. Nitrogen that's available later in the season tends to influence more what the grain protein is going to be. Okay, so that's an important concept. When we're looking at organic and conventional systems, using organic sources of organic sources of fertility as opposed to like soluble sources, the pattern of release is different, and it's released more slowly over time. And so, in thinking about this, I thought, well, maybe actually for organic systems, that's an advantage in bread wheat because you want to have protein available at the end to increase your protein, nitrogen available at the end to increase your protein levels. So I'm going to just talk quickly about one study I'm doing looking at that, and then we'll go into a bigger study that Heather and I are doing together. But this is a set of plots, a long-term cropping system study that was done in Maine from 91 to 2008. And it involved, the focus was on potatoes, and I worked in this in terms of nitrogen fertility and dynamics. But it did, among a bunch of treatments, it had one comparison of basically primarily an organic fertility system versus a conventional fertilizer-based fertility system. And the organic system relied on manures and compost and legume green manures. Really quickly, there was a difference in the soil itself. Soil quality improved drastically. And you can see that this is, I think this was in 2003 that we took this picture. So on the left, that is the organic or the amended system as we call it. And on the right is the fertilizer-based system. Huge difference in organic matter. And as you might imagine, a huge difference in how that soil performs in terms of supplying nutrients to the crop. So when, after the trial ended, and we were starting to bread wheat work, I thought, oh, here's a good opportunity to take these plots and actually plant wheat on them and look at nitrogen dynamics there. And so we planted 3 different varieties, a high protein variety, low yielder, a low yielding variety, a low protein, high yielding variety, and the heritage variety, red fight. But I'm just going to talk about one variety today. And then we use manure in the organic system, pre-plant manure. This is spring wheat. And then in the fertilizer-based system, we used different rates of ammonium nitrate, basically trying to match up, could we match protein levels at some point to do a comparison. So if you can go to the next slide. So that's what these treatments are. I'm missing some information here, but basically on all of these, on the x-axis, we have the manure treatment in red, and then the different fertilizer treatments increasing from 40 to 85 pounds per acre. And so plant nitrogen uptake, basically, you can see how the fertilizer treatments kind of gradually increased in nitrogen uptake. That was taken at the soft dose stage. Grain yield, even though the manure-based system did not have as high a nitrogen uptake. It actually had higher yields than any of the fertilizer. And grain yields are influenced not just by nitrogen, it's influenced by all sorts of things. And this, you saw the soil quality differences between those two pots. So there's definitely things going on that I'm not sure it's just nitrogen here, but could be water availability and other things. But I was really interested in looking at this idea of grain protein and maybe grain protein quality. So here at grain protein, you can see that, again, despite the differences in plant uptake, the organic or the manure-based system did pretty well comparatively. And then looking at protein as relative to how much N it took up. Basically, this graph here is trying to show what efficiency, and the manure treatment was more efficient, used its nitrogen more efficiently to increase grain protein. We're doing some other work looking at different, some of the rheological properties of the flour from this grain to see that if the different systems affected the protein quality. And then I'm working with a food scientist to look at nutritional and nutraceutical properties of the different grain. So this is preliminary. But what I think this shows is that an organic-based system can do very well in terms of achieving the yield of protein as compared to a fertilizer system. And it shows I think the importance of that timing. So that's spring wheat. Spring wheat, as Heather said, really we don't have that much of an issue with protein in spring wheat. And so, more importantly, the question is for nitrogen fertility in organic systems is how do you design a fertility system that works to produce the grain protein levels needed? And that is a problem in winter wheat. And to understand that challenge, just looking back at this growth curve again, for winter wheat, primarily in organic systems, we're applying pre-plant sources of fertility, right? It's the easiest way to do it when you're dealing with organic sources. And so that goes on here. The plant gets to, around here before it goes dormant and winter comes. And it's taken up 10, maybe 20 pounds of N. The requirement for wheat is generally around 80, 70, 80 pounds of N. And so there's a lot of nitrogen sitting there that could be lost over the winter. And then the high demand comes in after we have lost some of that nitrogen. The high demand is later on in the spring. In conventional systems, the way they've handled this is they do a split application and they top dress in the spring. And that's done to some extent in organic. So go ahead. So we came up with a study to look at this. Well, could we use top dressing to help boost protein levels in organic systems? Can top dressing nitrogen increase grain protein in organic production as well? What time of application is most effective? What sources of nitrogen are most effective? And then we added another question, because with organic sources, they need to be mineralized for the nitrogen to be released, mineralized by the microbial community in the soil. And if you're just top dressing and putting your fertility source right on the surface, how are they going to interact with the microbes? So we introduced a hoeing treatment, planting on wide rows to hoe and try to incorporate that top dress material. Okay. All right, so we had 3 times of nitrogen top dressing. Right now in Maine, growers will put on Chilean nitrate early at tillering. It may not be the most effective time in terms of trying to boost protein levels. So we had a late tillering application, flag leaf application, and boot. And then we looked at 2 different sources. We looked at a soluble source of nitrogen, so Chilean nitrate, which is probably not going to be with us that much longer for organic production. But it acts just like a fertilizer. It is. It's sodium nitrate, pretty much similar to ammonium nitrate. It's immediately available. And then we compared it with an organic source. In this case, we used dehydrated chicken manure, cheap, and that has about 25% soluble N and the rest as organic N. And so its release pattern is going to be really different than the Chilean nitrate. We put it on at twice the rate as the Chilean, just based on other studies that showed about 50% availability. And we assumed 100% availability for the Chilean. Okay. And then, as I was saying, we added this treatment in Maine for looking at hoeing based on some of practices we saw in Denmark that where they're growing on wider rows and using the hoe primarily for weed management, and Warren, the back's going to talk about that tomorrow. But we were interested in, could it be used to incorporate the top dress and increase nitrogen release from the top dress treatment. Okay. All right. So we did, in Maine, we did that at Tillering and at Flagleaf. Boot was just too late to even think about driving in. Flagleaf is still kind of, our farm manager was like, "Are you sure you want me to drive through that?" So go ahead. Okay, we did this in 2010, 2011, 2 sites, one in Maine, one in Vermont. All of the treatments, all of the top dress treatments had manure applied pre-plant. So this is winter wheat, applied manure in the fall, planted the wheat, and then next spring did the top dress treatments. We used the variety Harvard because it's known to have lower protein, and we thought, oh, we want a nitrogen responsive variety, which you'll see what happened with that. But we did have 2 controls, one where we just didn't add any nitrogen, no pre-plant manure application, and then one where we just did the pre-plant manure, no top dressing.
300 plants was not counting pillars.
Correct, that's
so
a seeding.
A lot more than that.
Yes, right, 300 plants. That was our target, right. Okay, so basically we have the treatments down here, so our 2 controls, and then the top dress treatments at different times for the Chilean and for the chicken manure. You can see right off that the yields are really high, especially in 2010. This is averaged over both years and both sites. But if you look at the control versus the manure control, applying manure before you plant is a good idea to boost yields. The only top dress treatments that affected yields, though, compared to the manure control, were the flagleaf and boot applications of Chilean. And I was really surprised by that, and I still am trying to figure out why the earlier Tillering one didn't have an effect, but in terms of the Chilean. In 2010, last year we had a lot of rain in the spring. Some of that could have been lost. Anyway. All right. More importantly, we're interested in the grain protein. Again, we have the same treatments on the x-axis. If you look at the 2 controls, you can see that while the pre-plant manure did affect the grain yield, it didn't actually increase grain protein. There was no effect by it. So the pre-plant source didn't really help with boosting the protein level. Why don't you go ahead and put it, yeah. So this is the increase in protein for each of the top dress treatments relative to that manure control. And here what you can see is that in general, later applications of top dressing were more effective than the earlier applications. And you can also see that the Chilean nitrate, the soluble source, was more effective than the dehydrated chicken manure. And that's even at a increase, a double rate for the chicken manure treatment. The actual increases that we saw, average over both years, the highest was an increase of 1.3 percentage points. Right? Something to note is that none of these treatments actually made that 12% standard, minimum level. And again, we chose Harvard, and I think if had we chosen a variety that was known to have higher protein, we would have actually been at that level, just under and just over 12%. Because a lot in our variety trials, as Heather showed, we saw you can get a 2% difference in protein by just choosing the right variety. So that's really the first step, is variety choice. Anyway, so, okay, go ahead. Oh, yeah, and I forgot. So our hoeing treatment, I had high hopes for that hoeing. I thought for sure it was going to help increased release of nitrogen from the chicken manure, but it really had no effect on grain yield at either of those timings or on protein.
Would it have been significant if you'd done pounds of protein instead of percent protein? Because you increased
Oh.
it slightly.
I could try that. I don't know.
I bet it'd be,
I could try it, yeah.
it'd definitely be more.
Yep, that's a good idea. So, in summary, we found that top dressing does increase grain protein. Later applications increase protein more than the earlier ones, so putting on later is better. Chilean nitrate was more effective, and hoeing had no effect. So we showed that, okay, we can boost protein levels with top dressing in organic systems. But really, the value of top dressing, the value of top dressing is going to be measured by, where that load of grain goes. If it actually makes 12% protein, it can go to the mill for bread flour and have a higher value than if it is under that 12% protein. It's going to be feed value. So I did a little quick economic accounting, I guess, and to try to look at, well, okay, let's just say that we had our top dressing treatment did actually boost it up to that 12%, and we're looking at the difference of did top dressing pay for itself, basically. And so I took in the cost of the nitrogen source and application, those are the negative values of their crop damage, so I assumed that we were putting it on later, when there is going to be some damage due to the wheel tracks of hoeing, unless you're on a tram line system. There's potential for increased yield, and so I took that into account, an average of 8 bushels per acre that we saw for the Chilean and those later applications. And then the value, the increased value, because you've been able to take it to the mill for bread wheat flour. And so you can see that the Chilean and the chicken manure both increase the value of the crop to some extent there. And so it does look like the economics, pay. But the question remains, well, what if that load of grain, or what if that field of grain would have made protein anyway? Or what if you did increase your protein levels and it still didn't make the right protein? And so that brings up questions of, well, is there some way that we could really look at in-crop or in-season diagnostics to evaluate what's the yield potential of the crop and what's the potential for needing protein? Are we going to be shy or are we not? We have that in the, people use PSNT in corn silage in manure-based systems, and it works really well, and people are using it in vegetables as well. We don't have that in wheat. The PSNT will not work because wheat is an earlier crop. It's all calibrated differently. But there is some, I think there is some work in Virginia, and Heather and I are just talking with another researcher about trying to look at these questions. Is there something we can do now to kind of make that choice, a decision tool for farmers, like, okay, is it worth the top dressing or not? Yeah. And just acknowledgements, and this is a little easier way to get to the Northern Grain, not the Northern, the Northern New England Local Bread Wheat website.